There's a lot of people who will do cycling all summer and then come and ski all winter. It's a lot easier on the body than running. So there will be 70, 80-year-old people out skiing, and in some of our citizens races, they'll be beating a lot of the younger people out there. So it's
And
a great sport for all ages.
hello, and welcome once again to the TriDoc Podcast. This is the August 22nd, 2025 edition, and I'm your host, Chuck Sankoff, the TriDoc, an emergency physician, a triathlete, a triathlon coach, and a multiple Ironman finisher, coming to you, as always, from beautiful, sunny Denver, Colorado. The voice that began the podcast today was that of Silas Eastman. Silas is the director of a cross-country ski park located in the northeast of the country, but he is joining me today to talk about something very different. He is endeavoring to begin the first ever roller ski competition on the beautiful Caribbean island of Saba. Now, Saba is an island that I have talked about before on this podcast. I had a guest on the program to discuss the Saba Triathlon. And Saba, as you may recall, is a location that's near and dear to me, a place that I have toyed with as a locale for my very own retirement, a place I am still considering quite seriously. And so when the opportunity came to talk to somebody about an endurance sport activity, again, taking place on that beautiful island, I couldn't resist in having that conversation. And so Silas will be on a little bit later to talk about what that looks like, but also to talk about why roller skiing might be something that endurance athletes and why roller skiing and why cross-country skiing might be something that endurance athletes like triathletes might want to consider incorporating into their off-season activities, something that unfortunately is coming up far too quickly for us in the Northern Hemisphere. Here we are almost at the end of August. It just seems to be flying by far too quickly. Before we get to that interview, though, I will have a medical mailbag segment, as always. I will not, however, be joined by my usual colleague, Juliet Hochman. Juliet is away on vacation this week with her family in Switzerland. Instead, I will be joined by a very capable substitute in the form of Griffin McMath. Griffin is the sometimes host of the Fast Talk Labs podcast, and I have collaborated with her in the past on that program. I am looking forward to having her join me on the Medical Mailbag, where we are going to talk about a subject that has been talked about to death pretty much everywhere but this show. I have reviewed this subject once before, but I've been asked about it so many times I thought that it was time to bring it back. And so today we are going to go deep into the world of creatine supplementation. Is this supplement, the one that you hear about all the time from coaches and from nutritionists and gosh, I don't even know who else, is this supplement something that really is going to help you get that much faster? Is it something that you really have to be taking? Why is everybody else around you taking it and you're not? Well, we're going to get to the bottom of it, and I'm going to give you a little bit of the punchline right now. You probably don't, but we'll go down that rabbit hole together, and we'll see if you agree at the end of it. Before we get there, though, I do want to share with you a little bit of a story from my recent vacation in Bonaire. I talked on my sister podcast with professional triathlete Matt Sharp last week on Tempo Talks. I discussed what it's like to train on vacation and especially what it's like to have a travel bike and how that makes cycling in your destination so much easier. I have owned a travel bike now for over a decade, and it has paid for itself many times over just by virtue of the fact that it's given me the freedom to ride easily wherever I go. The bike packs itself up into a suitcase-sized box, makes it very easy to travel with. I don't have to pay exorbitant bike fees. I just pay a standard bag fee. And it's easy to take for even short trips, as short as a weekend. I'm going to Salt Lake City in a couple of weeks for just a Labor Day weekend, and I'm going to pack it up and bring it with me and do some riding there. I understand that a travel bike may not be something that everybody wants to get, but I will tell you that if you're in the market for a road bike, and if you're somebody who does like to travel frequently and likes to train when they travel and likes to bike wherever they go, paying the premium to get couplers inserted into the frame of a custom bike is something that you really should look into. There are several bike companies that make them, Mine is made by Seven Cycles, but when I looked into it, there were many others. And now that it has expanded to more still. And it is just such a joy to be able to get to wherever you're going, take about 15 minutes to build up your bike, and then get out there on the roads and ride and see a place in a way that you otherwise can only dream of. Again, I understand this may not be something that people are going to just add to their quiver of bikes, but if you're in the market for a bike and you want a very high performance type of bicycle, but something that you can bring with you easily wherever you're going to make sure that you're able to get in your training and see a place, really see a place, this is something that you might want to explore. If you want to know more about this, reach out. I'd be happy to share my experience. I have a video on YouTube where I actually show how I break down my bike and pack it and how easy it is and the benefits of having it when I get to the other end. So just reach out. You can send me an email at tri_doc@icloud.com. I love to talk bikes. I love to talk travel. And when I can marry the two, better still. With that out of the way, let's move on to the medical mailbag. We're going to talk about creatine. That's coming up right now. It's time again for the medical mailbag, that segment of the program when I am usually joined by my friend and colleague and coach at Life Sport Coaching, Juliet Hockman. But if you are watching on the video, then you will note that it is not the visage of the fair Juliet who is joining me. Juliet is off in Switzerland this week. She is on a vacation with her family where she is in the Alps listening to the sound of music. I know that was Austria, not Switzerland still. And so I have asked a good friend, a often colleague over at Fast Talk Laboratories, Griffin McMath, to join me and fill in for Juliet this week as we discuss a medical subject. Griffin, thank you so much for being a part of the TriDoc podcast this week. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. I'm so excited. This is my inaugural episode with you on your podcast. This is a big moment for me. I'm very excited.
I know it's been quite a while since we've known each other. I've had a great pleasure of working with you on Fast Talk. So why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about you and how we know each other and what you do on a day-to-day. What has to happen for someone to say, oh my God, get Griffin?
Patience and enthusiasm is what it probably takes. So I'm a naturopathic doctor, so Dr. Griffin McMath. I'm not clinically practicing right now. I have in the past. I've had a really beautiful, very diverse career in the last however many years that I've been having a career. I stopped counting out of desire. But my last couple of years, I've lived in Colorado and had a really awesome exposure to the endurance sports community by way of my expertise in nutrition and integrative medicine, both from the prevention lens and that longevity lens. So I was hired by Coach Trevor Connors. Some of you may have heard of him, to be the chief content officer of the Paleo Diet. And he also owns Fast Talk Labs, which is just an incredibly amazing community, how I met you. And so by working through both of those companies, now Chris Case has taken over and I've stepped more into the Paleo Diet, but I still am a host on the Fast Talk podcast. And that's where I get to talk to just such brilliant people. And thankfully, you're local. And so I have had a chance to have coffee with you in real life and work with you through your knowledge, both as physician, not both, as physician, athlete, and coach. And that's what I do now from day to day is I occasionally bring my unique perspective to podcasts. I work with athletes and different scientific experts through that. And then day to day outside of that, I'm heavy into health literacy and nutrition and different partnerships that help bring that to life, both on the individual basis and systemic societal basis.
Well,
I just have a lot of fun talking to people like you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have very much enjoyed all of our collaborations, and you are perfectly well suited for the subject that we are going to be discussing today. This is A subject that it's something I actually discussed quite a while ago. I have to look back and see what episode it was, but I have been asked about it repeatedly. If it is everywhere. It is continuously brought up by nutritionists and coaches as something that athletes need to be taking, that need to be incorporating. And every time I'm asked about it, I say, look, I've looked at this. There's really not great evidence for it, but I get asked so frequently that I thought, you know what? Maybe I should take another look. And so here we are. The latest person to ask about it, and she did so very eloquently, is a longtime supporter of the podcast, Xenia Parker. She reached out and she wanted to know whether or not there is evidence to support the usage of creatine as a supplement for endurance athletes. In the past, when I've looked at this, the evidence I felt was a mixed bag. Some of the evidence was very glowing, overwhelmingly positive, but you could invariably find that all of the positive papers were basically either sponsored by or actually done by the makers of the supplement creatine. And the good studies that were untainted by industry tended to show that, in fact, for endurance athletes specifically, creatine not particularly useful. But I wanted to go back, and so I asked my intern, Nina Takashima, who was assigned this particular topic, to do a deep dive, and she went to town. She found quite a bit. And I asked her this time to also look and expound not just at creatine for athletics, but creatine has been bandied about as good for cognitive health. It's been looked at even for other kinds of health situations. And so she came back with an overview and a summary and some papers that look at creatine in a few major areas. So we're going to talk about creatine for endurance sport. We're going to talk about it in non-endurance athletics. We're going to talk about for cognitive brain health. And then we're going to talk about it for mental health. Those are the four areas that we're going to be talking about it. Griffin, have you had this kind of conversation with people as well? Are people, is creatine on your radar? I'm guessing in
Absolutely.
Fast Talk Labs, it must have been talked about as well.
Pick a circle that I've been in over the years, and it's been in the conversation. Even people, I don't want to say near end of life care, but so many different patient populations or indications, as you mentioned, the different areas that we'll go through, including some that weren't on that list. And in fact, in preparation for this episode, I was on a call with a friend earlier who's a Boulder cyclist, just now getting into running. And I told her what the podcast was going to be on. And she goes, okay, wait a minute. You have to tell me about this because everyone is talking about it right now. And I found it so interesting because I feel like creatine, made popular again in the 90s, is something where I think finally creatine's science is greater than the hype, which is not true for all supplements. And I think creatine is an exception there. And so I'm particularly excited to talk about it today. As you mentioned, it's one where we can talk about it from the lens of not just athletics, but as a whole person. What are the benefits? Where is it myth?
Let's start first just about how creatine or what creatine does. So creatine comes as a couple of different supplement forms. It comes as a monohydrate. It comes as a salt in the form of creatine hydrochloride. The monohydrate is not particularly water soluble. You can add it to things, but it tends to remain as a powder. So it's a powdery substance. It's gross. It can be packed into little capsules. So you could take it that way, but you have to take large amounts of this stuff. There is a hydrochloric acid salt, as I mentioned, creatine hydrochloride, and that is a little bit more soluble, but even that doesn't dissolve that well. And so when people try to put this stuff into smoothies or into whatever it is they're trying to take it still has a very chalky sort of this kind of grittiness it adds to things that it's taken in. But again, it can be packed into capsules, and that's a more convenient way of taking it. It is converted into phosphocreatine once it gets into the cells. And there it is basically incorporated into muscle, and it is involved in the biochemical process in which ATP is made. It also has a role in the anaerobic metabolism in that it can help in this. I'm not going to get into all the biochemistry, but the phosphocreatine process also is involved in buffering lactic acid. So It helps with the production of ATP, but it helps specifically when you're anaerobic. When you're aerobic, when you have plenty of oxygen and when you're operating in an aerobic capacity, the phosphocreatine process is not really activated quite as much. Now, creatine does get incorporated into muscle mass and it does contribute to the formation of muscle. It also, because it's an ester, it drags with it quite a bit of water. So when it comes into the cells, it tends to contribute to enlarging muscle mass, which is really why it got its start in the bodybuilding sphere, because bodybuilders found that by using it, it would really help build muscle mass. And indeed, there are a host of studies that show that if you take creatine supplements, you will build muscle mass, you will improve muscle definition, and you will improve muscle strength, especially when it comes to doing repetitive anaerobic types of things. So lift like bicep curls, which are done very rapidly. And when they're done before you can reoxygenate the muscle, having extra creatine can really help that process. So anaerobic, those kinds of strength related kinds of activities have been shown with good quality research to benefit from creatine supplementation. The problem is that's not what we do as triathletes, and it's not what cyclists or runners do. Cyclists, runners, triathletes are, for the most part, operating in an aerobic range. We don't now, cyclists, you could argue, especially like crit racers, even some cyclists who are road racing, they are going to be, for the most part, aerobic, but they are going to need to go into these anaerobic sections, sprints, for example, trying to make a breakaway, that kind of thing. So you could argue that very specific types of conditions for cyclists will need to surge into this anaerobic sort of area. But there is this caveat that cyclists are also very wary of the amount of weight that they're carrying with them, because there is an equation of watts per kilo. And if you have extra kilos, you may be taking away from the fact that you're generating extra watts. So for us as triathletes who are operating really within our aerobic capacity entirely, the benefits of creatine are not really being gotten. We are not getting into our anaerobic capacity, at least not very much, if at all. We are not using muscle mass to produce the kinds of activity or strength that we want. This is not an isometric sort of activity. We want to be producing locomotion, and therefore it's a matter of elongating our muscles continuously. And we know that carrying around extra kilograms of water, which is what a lot of these people who are taking large amounts of creatine are getting, is definitely a negative when you're cycling and certainly a negative when you're running. So all of the studies that we could find showed essentially that, and there were basically studies were pulled together to create these meta-analyses. And you'll recall that a meta-analysis is where you have like several studies that are small studies. You pool all the data together and then you reanalyze that data to see whether or not there's an effect in a larger population. Creatine just does not seem to be effective for long duration endurance sports, period. Any endurance sports that rely on aerobic metabolism just don't benefit from creatine supplementation. I don't think I could say it any more clearly than that, but
This isn't going to help you podium.
this is not going to be the thing that gets you over the edge. It's not going to give you a benefit. And for people who are taking this, they have to remember that the creatine is associated with these gains in muscle mass and is associated with water retention. The water retention, some people have argued, goes away over a period of time, but that's debatable. But definitely muscle mass goes up. And we're talking like people are taking like 20 grams a day. This is a lot. There's a and that's on the upper end. Some people are taking 5 to 7 grams a day. There's all kinds of different protocols, but up to 10 to 20 grams a day is what some people are taking of this stuff, which is really extreme. There's no downside to taking it. It's not, there's never been any health risks of taking creatine. I think that's important to point out. But for those people who,
unless you have severe kidney issues, but you wouldn't be on that
right,
anyway.
we wouldn't be
Yeah.
participating in these sports. But I think that most people who are thinking that and are buying into the hype, because creatine is pushed more than anything I've seen. And it is just continually being told that this is going to give us positive. And it's just not. It's just the evidence is very clear. And I have a host of studies here. Creatine for exercise and sport performance with recovery considerations for healthy population. Taking creatine will definitely improve muscle mass. It can help with ergogenic effects, but it doesn't seem to improve recovery. It doesn't allow for repeated efforts in any way. Effects of creatine supplementation on athletic performance in soccer players, a systematic review and meta-analysis, 20 to 30 grams of creatine supplement per day of 1 to 9 weeks. Significant improvements in anaerobic performance, and soccer players will have to do some sprinting, and so therefore will have some anaerobic performance there, but their aerobic performance was completely unchanged. And there were several studies that showed that. And even the anaerobic performance improvement was small, but it was there. It was statistically significant. It was just small. Creatine supplementation and endurance performance from 2023. This was a study that looked at all the other studies, and it was a review article that said, hey, creatine seems to help with surges and sprints. So if you are a cyclist, maybe this would help. It was a theoretical paper, but in summarizing the results, very clearly said, look, there's nothing out there that shows that in endurance sport, this is going to do anything. And then effects of creatine monohydrate on endurance performance in a trained population, systematic review and meta-analysis. Creatine supplementation ineffective on the endurance performance of trained population. And this was a very large meta-analysis that looked at thousands of athletes and just found absolutely no results whatsoever. In fact, seemed to trend towards negative, and the authors felt that likely was a reflection of the increased body mass that these athletes were carrying around because of the creatine they were supplementing with.
Something you just said there too reminds me of something that Trevor's gonna wherever Trevor is, he'll get like a little feeling, his ears will be ringing, that he often says when it comes to various supplementation or even sometimes more eccentric training techniques. For the beginner athlete, for the amateur, someone who's just getting out started, it might make a noticeable difference because the baseline for success is so low. But for someone who's been training quite a bit, it's going to be pretty minute differences, or to your point, even potentially negative because of what it's throwing off. And I think also the thing with creatine, and you talk about how it's one of the things that's been hyped the most, is because one, you talk about aerobic versus anaerobic, it really impacts those type 2 muscle fibers. And because it has impacted that in such a way, like I said, especially in the 90s for the bodybuilding competitions, we were able to see such a clear difference night and day. And so the human mind wants to be able to take something that has a clear difference and then apply it to anything else. But endurance athletes aren't using type 2 muscle fibers in the way that those sports, like you said, soccer, body lift, I don't want to call it like bodybuilding. Weightlifting,
Yeah.
thank you. Bodybuilding, weightlifting are going to be using those muscle fibers unless we talk about these small moments during the race, like surges or attacks, or mountain bikers might be using them at certain points. But those moments for a trained athlete, you're already going to have a strategy for them. So that little tip that of the scale that you might experience, there could be so many other things that could pinpoint to what your success was in that moment anyway, than it being creatine. Now, if it comes to not something that's going to help you podium, but something that's going to take care of you as a whole person and the different things that you have going on in your life or your body and rehabilitation, or you talked about cognitive activity, cognitive capacity, then that might be a contributor, but it's not going to be the thing that makes such a difference like we're used to seeing it on the soccer field or in the gym. It's just not.
Right. And what has really been a mystery to me is why, given the abundance of evidence that shows that this is just not useful for endurance athletes. Why this continues to be pushed as aggressively as it is by nutritionists, by coaches, and by supplement manufacturers, because they want to make a buck. But I've seen innumerable coaches and dietitians pushing creatine for endurance athletes, and I have never understood it because I have yet to see. And now, again, after looking at this again, there is still not any compelling evidence to show that this does anything. And I'm mystified why there is such infatuation with creatine as a supplement for endurance athletes. I just don't understand it because
Now,
it clearly doesn't
yeah.
work.
Are you seeing this more for athletes who are vegetarian or vegan receiving this recommendation?
No, it's just across the board. It's really interesting. But we are going to come back to that question that you just raised when we talk about mental health. I want to shift with the time we have left to talk about the neurocognitive and then the mental health questions, because those are interesting. I didn't touch on them the first time I talked about creatine, but I want to touch on them now because we looked at the research and we found a couple of papers. The first one was The Effects of Creatine Supplementation on Cognitive Function in Adults, a systematic review and meta-analysis. That was from 2024. Basically, the problem with a lot of these studies is that they don't tend to use a standardized protocol. So they give adults varying amounts of creatine, and it's hard to know how much is the right amount and whether or not there are confounding variables. Are they taking other things at the same time? It's hard to know. But this was an interesting study where they looked at, what they said to start was individual studies have showed varying degrees of the effects of creatine on cognitive function, executive function, and how, as adults age, creatine may be protective on some of these things. So when you think about dementia and memory loss and just how confusion progresses with age, there have been some studies that have suggested that creatine can be protective. But it's not clear whether or not, as I said, the creatine was alone. So they looked at paper where they systematically looked at all of the papers that have looked at this and basically showed that, alas, unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a dramatic impact of creatine in this way. It doesn't actually reverse any neurocognitive declines. There is some evidence that suggests that it's possible that people who take creatine supplementation may have a protective effect in the 18 to 60-year-old age sort of range, but it's not 100% clear. There's nothing, basically, all of the studies that have looked at this have not come to any overall great conclusion. But there is a sort of signal here that suggests that it's possible that creatine may be protective against developing some of these neurocognitive declines. In healthy 18 to 60-year-olds, it does not do anything to reverse existing cognitive deficits.
I think that's what we have to be really cognizant of is, are we holding it to the expectation that it's going to be this miraculous reversal, or are we saying, hey, use this and it can pump the brakes or it can put a little protective buffer? And many would argue, hey, I'm not going to ask for the world and ask for a reversal, but I'll take something that will slow this down as still being a really awesome impact, especially for women, especially women going through variety of different stages later in life. People who are depressed will take that. And I think I have seen it in circles be recommended to. The one thing I will say to this when it comes to endurance athletes and this overlapping indication we're talking about here is it being recommended in highly stressed out or high, I don't know how else to be like really polite about this, but like high executive functioning people who are really putting a cognitive stress on their lives day to day. So students, very strategic executives, people who are really using their brains a lot during the day, they may be recommended creatine to help them in that aspect. So when it comes time for training, this kind of cognitive depletion that they've had throughout the day isn't impacting their training or something else. So I feel like those situations you see it. And then because of the weight issue, people are even, we talk about people microdosing other things. So people who are starting to microdose creatine instead of going straight for the 20, that they'll start with 2 or 3 over time. And I think that research is pretty nascent. And so I'm really curious to see what happens with that
Yeah,
impact
as
as
it goes
well.
on.
Yeah.
On this study actually, it found 16 articles that it ended up including. There was only about 500 participants that were analyzed. But in those 16 studies, the dosages ranged anywhere from 0.3 grams per kilogram a day all the way up to 20 grams a day. So there's a wide range of what people can take for
Yeah.
this potential neuroprotective benefits. And it gets back to what you were saying earlier, which is there are various reasons to take this, and it could be a whole body kind of thing. I just want to be very clear. If you're taking it for neuroprotective kind of things, the science is not 100% clear. There's certainly, as I said before, there's no downside except that you will probably retain some water, gain some weight, but you're not going to get a benefit for your endurance sport. Will you get a benefit for your neurocognitive capabilities? Probably not a benefit, but you will potentially see less decline as you age. Maybe that's still to be determined. So interesting. There's another study we came across that came out just this year. Creatine shows potential to boost cognition in Alzheimer's patients. Really small study, no control group. So really hard to know whether or not this is anything, but clearly a sort of a study that is to generate hypotheses and will probably be followed up by something randomized controlled. And basically what they showed is that patients who took 20 grams a day of creatine for 8 weeks seemed to have some improvement in their cognitive function. So that'll be, again, something to follow and could be very interesting because not a drug, just something, a nutritional supplement that could have an impact on Alzheimer's patients. Conversely, when they've looked at patients with Parkinson's disease over an 8-year period, a very well-designed study, 860 participants in a control group, 860 in the experimental group over 8 years, 10 grams of creatine a day, no benefits at all. They stopped the study because clearly creatine does not help with Parkinson's. And that's not terribly surprising. Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, two very different diseases. They operate completely separately in very different ways. So just because creatine helps in one doesn't mean it should help in another. So not that surprising.
And I'm curious for you too, and I know we're talking about mental and emotional health in a separate juncture or separate section here, but post TBI.
So that was one I was going to bring up next, and there
Okay.
have been a couple of studies on that,
Yeah.
but the studies are very preliminary, and we didn't include them because we felt they were so preliminary. That keeps being brought up as creatine seems to be protective against post-concussion syndrome, but those studies were very small. The results were very equivocal, so we are not convinced. We
Okay.
would like to see more research on that, but it is another potentially promising area where creatine may have benefit is in post-concussion, post-TBI, in being neuroprotective. And again, it's this whole area where creatine may have an impact in the brain that we just don't understand.
Absolutely. And I will only say this as anecdotal, obviously, but I think I've had a
The
variety of
moose.
concussions,
Yes.
not just the
The
moose. I've
moose.
had so many tumbles on this cranium, but nearly every neurological provider, and I say that widely because I've seen so many specialists at this point, several of them over the last decade would typically recommend creatine be part of my post-concussion regimen for the neuroprotective aspects, but also for the mental emotional impact, which
I,
then
I,
we're going to
I
get to, and it's
honestly,
pretty
it's the kind
interesting.
of thing I would probably take and
Yeah.
recommend to people as well, because there is some early evidence that it may help. There's certainly no downside to it. And why not, right? Post concussion, we don't understand it. There is absolutely nothing you can take or do for it. If creatine turns out to help, then why not give it a try? I would certainly say, yeah, go for it.
Absolutely. And I think you met me too after the moose thing too. I was for some reason really underweight. So I was like, yeah, let's go to town on this creatine. No worries about slow loading. I just went full dose that.
Your N of one was a
And that's the
success.
important thing to remember is.
But as I've said many times, just because the research shows X, if your experience was Y, that's really all that matters. All right, we'll finish this up by talking about the last study, which was, I thought, particularly interesting, and that was dietary creatine intake and depression risk among US adults. This was a purely observational study, so it does not tell us anything definitive, but it's really interesting and basically shows that if you take into account lifestyle variability, if you take into account a whole bunch of different things, you control for a whole bunch of different factors, creatine intake is inversely associated with the risk of depression, but it is sex specific. So it seems to matter much more in women than it does in men. And it's fascinating, but basically the highest quartile of creatine consumption, so the people taking in the highest amount of creatine, had a 31% lower risk of depression, all things taken into consideration, which I think is fascinating. Now, I don't really know what to do with this. It's not saying that if you take creatine, you'll be less depressed, because I brought up the point when we were discussing this paper. I'm like, people who are in good mental health probably have better diet and better dietary choices and might be taking in more creatine naturally, but presumably they try to control for some of those things. So I'm not really 100% sure, but as an observation, and the table, which our lovely and talented editor Lauren will remind me, and we will put the table over the video here so people can see. The table is really remarkable. Shows in a very stepwise fashion how increased creatine in, decreased depression out. It's quite amazing. And that goes back to what you were asking about vegan diets and should vegans supplement with creatine. I don't know what the answer is. You can get creatine by eating eggs, taking in dairy products and fish. But if you are strictly vegan, you may not be getting enough creatine to forestall depression, if indeed the two are linked in a causal relationship. And this paper does not tell us that.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that people need to keep in mind, especially if you're listening to this and you or someone you know has clinical depression or a sustained depressed mood, is it's one of those things that's so complex. And to your point, there are all these different systemic inputs. It's like this vicious cycle for depression. And that can be really soul crushing for someone who's experiencing it. But here is the benefit, or the silver lining of that, is if you are able to get one entry point in, you can typically have this domino effect. So if someone isn't having a good diet because they're not motivated or they're having some of these issues, and one domino starts to fall and they have a little motivation to choose something different, that like it is one of these things that over time and with certain resources, some of these things are worth exploring and talking to your physician or your registered dietitian about. And so it's one of those things where you don't want to look at nearly anything when it comes to mental health as the magic cure-all, but what you can look at it as, is this a unique entry point for me in this loop that is my particular situation, and starting to put the pieces together. And creatine, as you discussed with this pretty awesome result here, can be one of those entry points for a variety of women experiencing depression.
Very well said. And I
Thanks.
can't think of a better way to finish than on that note, a positive note. If you or someone you know is suffering from mental health issues, and certainly if that person or yourself is suffering from any thoughts of self-harm, I hope that you will do us a solid and reach out for help, because I promise you, you are valued. That's all we have for the medical mailbag this week. I cannot thank you enough, Griffin, for being here and joining me for this segment. I hope that we will have the chance to get you back on here again. If not on the medical mailbag, we'll have to have you as a guest, because I always enjoy chatting with you. Nobody came through with our trip to Italy. I'm very disappointed about that. Yeah.
Listen, this is not over. I've been scoping things out. We'll discuss this later. This is not come to pass. All right.
All right. And if you don't know what we're talking about, Griffin and I did an episode on Fast Talk Labs where we talked about caffeine, and we posited that someone should send us to Italy on an exploratory trip to check out Italian cafes. Hasn't happened yet, but we can hope. Griffin McMath, thank you so much for joining me. I will include a link to where you could find Griffin on Fast Talk Labs in the show notes. Until next time, I hope that you have enjoyed this segment of the podcast. I'll have the interview coming up in just a second. But if you have a question you'd like to hear answered on the medical mailbag in the future, I hope that you'll reach out. You could send me an email at tri_doc@icloud.com. You can drop a question into the Facebook group, the private Facebook group for the podcast. What? You're not a member? How can that be? If you're not a member, look up the TriDoc Podcast on Facebook, answer the 3 easy questions, will gain you admittance, and we would love to have you join the conversation and ask your questions there. Until next time, we'll be back then. Thanks again, Griffin.
Thank you.